I think there will be changing trade patterns. There'll be shifts in global supply chains, definitely between BRICS trade and BRICS countries, but certainly from countries in and outside of the BRICS. And I think technological innovation, we've spoken a lot. We talk almost exclusively about strategic sectors like artificial intelligence, about quantum computing, about green technology, and we focus on America. And that's fair enough. America has some of the most powerful companies at the moment. We've got companies like Meta and Google and OpenAI developing fantastic technology, and many others working on quantum computing. We know the US and the UK has some of the world's best universities, and they're producing fantastic. But I think we're a little bit blind to the technology being produced by many BRICS countries. And I think that could potentially play a very, very significant role on competition. And we're blind to it right now, I think.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Risk Management Show interview with Dominic Bowen. Dominic is a partner at To-Secure and widely recognized as one of Europe's foremost experts in risk management, with over 2 decades of experience in mitigating risks and managing crises across various industries and geographies. His strategic insights and hands-on approach have been instrumental in safeguarding a business's interests against emerging threats and ensuring operational resilience amongst some of Europe's most impactful companies. So, Dominic, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thank you very much, Boris. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to have you on our show. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the interesting topic of the rise of BRICS Plus and the risks for business leaders and the risk managers derived from this geopolitical process. But before that, Dominic, could you tell us a short story about your career path, what brought you to where you are right now, and what you guys at To-Secure are up to these days?
Yeah, thanks very much for asking, Boris. So I've been really blessed with some amazing opportunities. I started my career as a police prosecutor, and then I evolved into a special agent with the Australian Federal Police. I served overseas in several countries. I then was able to deploy overseas with the Australian Special Operations Command as a captain to several countries in Asia and the Middle East. I then stopped working for the government and worked for a series of for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. And I've had the real blessing of being able to work in so many amazing communities in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Haiti, Lebanon, and many others. And it's been a real blessing to learn about how different cultures, how different industries and professionals manage risk and lead operations. And today I work with large European companies on helping them pursue their opportunities in a way that mitigates risk.
Absolutely, because the geopolitical risk has risen sharply in recent years, increasingly affecting these businesses all over the world. Whether this as effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Middle East, and the tension with the U.S. and China relationship. So I think it will be great to hear your opinion on this topic of primary drivers behind the rise of BRICS, and maybe could you explain the economic growth and the global influence factors that have contributed to the formation and expansion of this bloc?
Yeah, thanks very much. And the BRICS actually was a term that was actually coined by Goldman Sachs, the financial institution many of your listeners will know. And the original BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they've been trying to expand their influence for the last couple of decades. And really a big point of that is challenging the traditional dominance of Western-led organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. And some of the recent summits, the most recent in October of 2023, really highlighted their goal of creating alternative financial systems and trade mechanisms that reduce reliance on the US dollar and reduce reliance on existing post-World War II international institutions. BRICS nations have long criticized the World Bank and the IMF for perpetuating Western dominance and imposing what they believe is stringent conditions that don't necessarily align with local needs. And what some analysts are predicting is that there is a shift in global economic power, and this could result in different trade, different diplomacy, and different development strategies. But now what we've seen is the five original countries have now been joined by six new countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Argentina. I think it's worth mentioning, Boris, in our analysis, really is a limit to what the BRICS can achieve. And I think that it's not fair to assume that the BRICS are necessarily representative of the global South. The G20 includes many global South nations, and I believe really is best placed to thresh out many of the global economic issues. There's increasing tensions between the US and China, and definitely, as you mentioned, after Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine, there is a desire for growing power amongst several developing economies, and this needs to be considered, and there needs to be greater democracy around the world. You talked about the expanding power. I mean, the BRICS Plus includes between 37 and 46% of the global population. I mean, that's nearly half, or at least a third of the world's population, and 29% of global GDP. If you compare that to Europe, for example, Europe's GDP is about 15% of global GDP. So it certainly is. The BRICS powerhouse as a collective is quite powerful, and it includes two of the three largest oil producers of the world, and certainly the two largest countries under sanctions globally. And so I think that might give listeners some understanding about the challenges, but it's not a homogenous group. They're too diverse to have a single currency or free trade area like the NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, and definitely too diverse to have anything like the EU or the Schengen area. I think perhaps it's sadly, but I think it's reasonable to say the BRICS Plus is a little bit like some well-known and underperforming football teams, that the 11 members of BRICS are less than the sum of all their parts, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think they have the idea to establish their own kind of BRICS bank. I don't know if it's still functioning to send loans to other countries. But I know also that China is very active in other countries, like you mentioned, that not happy with G7 institutions, and they kind of put a lot of credit facilities in Africa, and also other countries are not happy with China's loans because they kind of take a mortgage of all this their hard assets. If they don't pay, they just take like ports or stuff like this. So I'm not sure if they trust also in the system. So do you have an opinion on this?
I think that's very, very valid. And there's so many diverse interests and political interests amongst the members of the BRICS Plus. There's definitely physical conflicts if we consider the relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran, if we consider the relationships between Ethiopia and Egypt. And even, if we bring all these new members into the BRICS Plus, the new members are actually only contributing about 4% to the group's cumulative GDP. So it's not adding a lot, but it is bringing a huge amount of complexity. But there has been substantial growth over the last 2 decades. And you mentioned some of those points around they want to have increasing power. They want to have increasing influence over the global markets. Now, in 2000, the BRICS countries accounted for about 8% of the global economy, but I mentioned just before that it's much higher now. It's closer to 30%.
No.
And as these countries have really tripled their economic power, they want a similar amount of power when it comes to the politics and geopolitical stage. And China in particular has been a driving force behind this. China is still the world's second largest economy, and its influence has grown across sectors. It's not just a single sector, but it's across multiple sectors. Manufacturing, infrastructure, technology, and finance continue to be healthy and growing sectors within China, notwithstanding their huge challenges around some of their domestic consumption and around their property sector. But then there's India. India is another major power within the BRICS, and it's set to become the world's most populous country and is already a significant leader in sectors such as information technology and pharmaceuticals. And its growth rate, India's growth rate is over 7%, which is outpacing many Western countries. But in other countries within the BRICS, like Brazil, Russia, South Africa, face serious, very, very serious internal challenges. And this is revolving around the leveraging of natural resources, the regional influence that several countries play, their role in energy markets, agriculture, and trade. And then, of course, you alluded to the efforts around the de-dollarization.
Mhm. Okay, let's discuss the dollarization as it has been a key topic with BRICS Plus. How do you view this strategy as a geopolitical tool, and what risks does it pose for business leaders and financial markets that rely on the US dollar? Because there are a lot of markets of US dollar, not only based in the USA, there are a lot of euro kind of dollar market that countries between each other issue, right?
Oh, very much so. And I think this is the most striking challenge that the BRICS Plus presents to the Western system. And I think this focus on de-dollarization is something that should be monitored. The global reliance on the US dollar is paramount. It's why the US still has such power. Logistics change are unquestionably centered around China. Huge amounts of European companies, very large, if not their entire supply chain, either come through or originate in China. But the world still trades on the US dollar, and the dollar maintains its primacy as the reserve currency of the world and the medium really for international trade. And it's a huge source of power for the United States. Now, the dollar's dominance allows the US to maintain influence over global trade and finance. And there's mechanisms such as the SWIFT payment system and the ability to impose sanctions on countries. In fact, over 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars, and nearly 90% of global trade is conducted in dollars. So, say that again, over 90% of global trade is conducted in US dollars, which means there's a huge power that the US government has on global trade. But the BRICS countries are actively seeking to reduce this dependence on the US dollar. Russia and China, in particular, have been at the forefront to establish efforts to create an alternative financial system. Now, since the imposition of Western sanctions on Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine, the most recent one in 2022, Russia has dramatically pivoted towards China, pivoted towards Iran, pivoted towards India, pivoted towards South Africa, other BRICS partners to conduct trade in local currency rather than US dollars. And at the same time, China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has fetched over $100 trillion in infrastructure projects across Asia, Pacific, and Europe, has increasingly promoted the use of the Chinese yuan in international transactions. In fact, at the most recent summit that I talked about in October 2023, discussions really centered on the creation of a new BRICS currency for use in trade between member states. Now, this is still in the early stages, but if they were successful, and I'm not sure that they will be, but if they were successful and they were able to undermine the US dollar's hegemony, this would weaken the West's ability to influence global trade policies because of the US dollar. Now, the BRICS countries are actively pursuing these strategies to reduce their dependence on the US dollar through the use of their own currencies and local currencies in inter-BRICS trade and the development of an alternative payment system to SWIFT. And this was discussed recently. I think they're calling it the BRICS Pay, but at this stage, there's still some significant question marks around BRICS Pay and whether this is a viable payment system.
Yeah, I heard that they stockpiling the gold now because I think Chinese banks don't allow now anymore Russian rubles, and because they are afraid to go to be under sanctions. So there are commodity trades just. Yeah, interesting. And what has been the response of Western governments and institutions onto this challenge? How might this geopolitical tensions affect global trade and supply chain and maybe risk management strategies?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And Western powers, particularly the United States, European Union, and Australia, they're not blind to the risks of the BRICS and the BRICS Plus and the associated risks of their global influence. The G7, for example, has strengthened their alliances and have been actively involved in efforts to counterbalance China's Belt and Road Initiative and to try and find ways to plug holes in the sanctions that have been leveled against countries like Iran, like Russia, members of the BRICS and BRICS Plus. There's an example, the European Union's Global Gateway Initiative, for example, which aims to mobilize 300 billion in euro to fund global infrastructure projects in order to counterweight China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not sure whether this will be as successful as China's BRI, but it's certainly an initiative of the EU to counterweight it. And at the same time, the US is focusing on strengthening its ties across the Indo-Pacific region as part of its broader strategy to contain China's influence. Now, there's military partnerships such as the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue with India, Japan, Australia, and the US. This is a big part of the US's Indo-Pacific strategy. And the West also continues to use economic sanctions as a tool to limit the strategic ambitions of countries like Russia, like Iran. But the effectiveness of these approaches and some sanctions, is increasingly being questioned by BRICS countries and by some others. It's quite interesting. There's quite a few angles. We talked about the military, we talked about the economic, but there's also the rule of law and the democratic nature. The most recent EU Eurobarometer public opinion survey that was released in July 2024, and that said that 72% of Europeans considered that the EU plays an important role in helping to uphold the rule of law. 89% of Europeans say it's important for them that EU member states respect the core values, including human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And 86% of surveyed Europeans say it's important for them that the media and civil society are able to operate freely and without pressure, even if they're critical of the government. And you certainly can't say this in all of the BRICS Plus member states. So I think there's certain strengths that democracy and the rule of law brings in countries like America, Australia, and the European Union that many of the BRICS nations are not having. And I think perhaps you could see the realization when you compare some of the growth, inflation, and deficit statistics.
Mm-hmm. And from a risk management perspective, how should business leaders prepare for such uncertainty surrounding this BRICS Plus initiative? What specific geopolitical or economic risk should they monitor?
Well, I think business leaders and risk managers should be looking at the macro level first. So if we look at growth, growth is going to be much slower in the European Union than it is in many BRICS nations. America obviously is looking at quite healthy growth, and we're expecting 2025 and Q4 of 2024 to be very healthy. The EU is talking about its return to growth, but expectations still remain between 1 and 1.6%. But inflation is an area where perhaps the BRICS are much weaker. We've got Russia with inflation at about 9 to 9.5%, 4% in Brazil and South Africa, compared to the 2.5% in the EU and America. We've got growing budget deficits in Brazil, India, and Russia, whereas deficits are declining to below 3% within the EU by 2025. If we look at the more tactical or operational level, I think there's quite a few economic and financial risks that CEOs, boards, and business leaders need to be monitoring. I think they should be monitoring the increased use of local currencies in intra-BRICS trade, monitoring the development of the alternative payment system to SWIFTs like the BRICS Pay, and tracking any progress towards a potential BRICS reference currency and to understand the impact on their contracts, on their trades, and what that could mean with the balance of payments for the countries they're trading to and from. And this push for de-dollarization could impact currency risk exposure for companies that are trading in multiple currencies, as well as the international payment processes for business operating in BRICS countries. I think businesses should also be monitoring the NDB, that's the New Development Bank activities. What are their lending patterns? What are their project approvals? And compare the NDB's growth and influence relative to the IMF and World Bank, because this will have an impact on nation states' economic policies, because of course the IMF and World Bank often tie their funding practices to reforms within governments. And then, of course, there's the geopolitical risks that all businesses need to be monitoring when they're working with and trading and their supply chains are impacted by BRICS countries. There's the shifting alliances between BRICS members and Western nations, tracking potential new BRICS members and their impacts on the geopolitical stance, as well as the positioning of other global South countries. So I'd be looking for new sanctions affecting BRICS members, monitoring trade disputes between BRICS nations, especially obviously with the upcoming US elections. We saw with the Trump and Harris debate, talk about tariffs again. And that's certainly something we expect to change in January 2025. So I think the geopolitical conflicts, the trade disruptions, the economic impacts for businesses operating in or with BRICS countries could be quite significant.
Awesome. So very interesting. So I would like to ask you a personal point of view, Dominic. What is the major misconception in the geopolitical risk space that you kind of strongly disagree with?
That's a fantastic question, Boris, and it's quite a challenging one. I think there is a tendency. I've spoken a lot over the years about how do groups like ISIS can massively overtake, over half of Syria at one point, a third of Iraq. How does 1 million people in Bangladesh get displaced overnight by communal violence? How does a country like Ukraine get invaded by Russia and so many people are surprised by it? And I think I use those examples because they're things that people often don't understand, because I think we're a little bit like the frog in the boiling water. We don't realize when change is coming. We don't think change, especially change that doesn't work for us, change that maybe isn't commensurate or consistent with our business interests. We ignore it, we dismiss it because we have confirmation bias. Now, I think the de-dollarization efforts of the BRICS is not necessarily going to be successful. I do, however, think that there could be changes in regulatory standards. I think BRICS members, the more powerful, the more influential they get. And as this becomes more attractive to other countries that maybe are on the edge of the current system, countries like Burma, for example, other dictator states, I think they're going to be much more difficult to track when it comes to things like data privacy, intellectual property protection, environmental standards, and definitely financial reporting. I think regulatory arbitrage opportunities are going to exist for companies, but also challenges for companies that want to operate within the rule of law. I think there will be changing trade patterns. There'll be shifts in global supply chains, definitely between BRICS trade and BRICS countries, but certainly from countries in and outside of the BRICS. And I think technological innovation, we've spoken a lot. We talk almost exclusively about strategic sectors like artificial intelligence, about quantum computing, about green technology, and we focus on America. And that's fair enough. America has some of the most powerful companies at the moment. We've got companies like Meta and Google and OpenAI developing fantastic technology, and many others working on quantum computing. We know the US and the UK has some of the world's best universities, and they're producing fantastic. But I think we're a little bit blind to the technology being produced by many BRICS countries. And I think that could potentially play a very, very significant role on competition. And we're blind to it right now, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think we know Indians as a kind of IT guys in all major companies, and now I think many of them are CEOs of large companies in like Google or Microsoft. Yeah, so it's certainly in the West world we know a lot of guys from BRICS countries, but not specifically. We don't know what is produced there. Although we know, like in Europe, we know that Chinese kind of products are dumped here, like solar panel and now electric car. So it's a major problem with EU on these tariffs. Yeah. So let's summarize. If someone who is listening to this interview would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would it be?
The BRICS and the BRICS Plus countries have very significant economic ambitions, and these have important geopolitical, economic, and business ramifications. There is a growing alignment between some countries, even countries that are not a homogenous group, but there is a group of countries that believe they have been marginalized by the traditional Western systems, and there's going to be pushback. The bloc's expansion to countries like Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Indonesia, Iran is going to have economic and political ramifications, and business leaders need to be monitoring it. We're working with a lot of companies that are getting ahead of this curve and trying to understand the impacts and the opportunities, because with every new risk, and I'm sure you speak a lot about this on the podcast, Boris, with every new risk that emerges, there's opportunities for businesses. You just have to make sure you're on the right side of that headwind.
All right, fantastic, Dominic. That's were all my questions. Perhaps if I forgot to ask you something that you feel important for our audience, please go ahead.
No, I think that's been a really interesting conversation, Boris. I think it's a great, anything we can do to encourage business leaders, politicians, policy advisors to be thinking outside of the box, to be asking questions, to be curious, and not to be dismissing something they see as a non-idea. I think we're putting ourselves, our businesses, and our economies in the best position to be doing that.
All right, thank you, Dominic, and I wish you a great success to you and to your company, to strategists, and I hope we will be cooperating in the future.
I'm sure we will. Thanks very much, Boris, and thanks very much to the listeners.
Bye bye.